Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of Our Lives. And this week, we are really lucky to be joined by Oscar Jacques, who is the founder of LifeReel. This concept I really loved, and we talk a lot on this podcast about the inevitable happening. People are going to pass, people are going to age. And what Oscar's done is created a community to keep people's stories alive, which I think is fantastic. Oscar, tell us about LifeReel. What is LifeReel and how did it come about?
So a life reel is kind of like it's a short documentary film about the life of somebody that you love. We all are used to, I suppose, watching Netflix documentaries about important people who have Wikipedia pages and all of this kind of stuff. But I think I've always believed, and I think a lot of people believe, that everybody has a story to tell, even, yourself and the people that you're closest to, the people you love the most. And so what I'm trying to get people to do is to sit their loved ones down in front of a camera like this and just chat with them for a few hours and capture all of their life story. We all talk about writing these things down, and very few of us ever actually get around to it. So I feel like, coming from a video background, and because I'm very lazy as well, this only takes an afternoon, so that's what I'm trying to get people to do. That's my whole reason for being online at the moment.
I love this. And when I came across your page on TikTok, I'm an avid TikTok user, probably more than I probably should.
Me too.
It really hit home for me because there are stories. I lost my dad very young, and he used to tell me some amazing, hilarious, probably not repeatable on air stories about when he was in the army, about his younger days. And I think I remember those stories because he sat down and told them to me. Will my children remember those stories? I think my dad is probably, and their grandfather is probably, quite an abstract concept to them. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. Would you agree?
Yes, I think I spent my granddad, my mum's dad. He's the only grandparent I never met. He died before I was born, and he's always been very much that for me, an abstract concept. I grew up with my mum telling me, when I would do something or act in a certain way, she'd go, "Oh, my dad always used to act like that." And my understanding is that he was, this very, very happy man who was always smiling, kind of a preternaturally happy person. And so he's sort of been this sort of mythologized legend in my family. And what I would have wished to have had is some kind of interview with him, whether it was written down, whether it was a video interview. I think these people that we have in our lives are not always going to be around, and I think we owe it to them and to future generations of our family to kind of capture those stories while we can.
I absolutely agree. And I think regret is an awful thing. And I think quite often we think about capturing these things when it is too late. My grandmother, who I do mention a lot on this podcast, by the way, she was the sweetest, most adorable little old lady, but she always told me this one story and it really sticks with me. And again, I wonder whether this story will pass, is when she was younger, she was walked home by a policeman in our little old town. And he tried some what she described as funny business with her, and she knocked his helmet off and ran away. Now, I always think of her as a little sweet old lady, and I think for me, I love that story. But also remembering that she was a young person. She wasn't always this sweet little old lady. Do you come across that a lot in your line of work?
It's difficult, isn't it? I think sometimes to put yourself in the shoes of anybody else besides yourself. Like I struggle with that. I think we all do. But yeah, I think, growing up, you'd listen to stories from your parents and your grandparents. And I think perhaps your parents particularly, because they have such a level of authority over you, it seems totally alien a concept that they might have once been your age and making the same silly mistakes that you were. And I mean, that's a great story about. Was it your grandma, did you say?
It was my grandmother, yeah.
I think that's I think those are really important humanizing stories as well, though, because I think when you're growing up, it's very difficult for young people to conceive of their parents and their grandparents as kind of real people. They're avatars in your life that are there to kind of taxi you from A to B and tell you to do stuff and tell you not to do stuff. And it's only when you get a little bit older, I think, maybe in your early to mid 20s, that you start realizing that they're actually real people that think and feel in the same way that you do. I think that's why I'm so interested in in talking to people and recording their stories, because I think more than recording for their sake, more than recording for the future generation's sake, for our sake as individuals, I think it can be a good way of reminding yourself that your parents are real people.
I completely agree. I'm not sure. I'm thinking on this now. Is I would love to do this for my children. I'm not sure that I have got some stories that I think I'd like them to know, but perhaps not while while they're still perhaps easily influenced. I can think of a few stories that I think would live on, but perhaps not for telling at this moment. So I think that would be really, really valuable.
How old are your kids?
My children are 16 and 18. So
Yeah,
they
maybe
are
two
coming
maybe
of an
two
age.
years, 2 or 3 years, then you can probably say whatever you like.
Yeah, I think that the legacy can live on. That I'd say it wasn't always a wild child, but I absolutely was, and I don't think that's going to come as a shock to any of them. To be perfectly honest, how did this idea come about, and how did you get into creating this community and creating this concept?
Well, the community is a relatively new thing, but I suppose my story in LifeReels is I started filmmaking at a very early age. I was like, I stole my actually. I'm just thinking, I've brought props with me today. I've
Fantastic.
this is my grandpa's, my dad's old Sony Handycam, and I remember stealing that when I was maybe 9 years old and making lots of little short films with my friends, and that's kind of I've just never really stopped doing that. And so I would watch a lot of YouTube videos from filmmakers, and there was a video I came across by a filmmaker I still follow, a man called Philip Bloom, and he sat his father down in front of a camera one day, and he just made this little documentary, asked him a bunch of questions, scanned some of his family photos. You saw some of the old cine reels of his dad when he was younger, and he just collated it into this 25-minute film about a man called Arnie, who actually only passed away a few months ago, as it happens. And I remember being, I don't know, maybe 13, 14, watching this and thinking, how am I so enthralled by a 25-minute film about an ordinary man who I will never meet? And it really cemented in me. I think I kind of had this lightning moment in my mind of like, everybody is actually a very interesting person if you just take the time to listen to their stories. And so I was obsessed with this filmmaker Philip Bloom at the time, and so I thought I'm going to do the same thing for my grandma. Her name is Eileen. She was from Liverpool, and I didn't get to see her that much. She would only come up during Christmas. So when she came to visit one year, I just asked her if she would sit down in front of a camera and just answer some questions that I had about her life, and she was always telling stories. She was the kind of person who really worked on her stories, and she would tell you the same ones again and again, and there were always slight differences in the way that she told them, so you can
We
never
love a
quite
bit of
tell.
embellishment. We love that.
Absolutely. And you could never quite tell what was true and what wasn't, and sometimes one thing happened and then another time another thing happened. But I thought, it's better to have them recorded than not have them recorded, no matter whether or not they're completely true.
Definitely, definitely. I think it's really interesting about what you mentioned before about you could write them down. I'm not convinced it has the same impact writing down somebody's story. I
I think
don't.
you're right.
Yeah, I think hearing somebody's voice, their mannerisms, their expressions, I think all that for me would add to how relatable it was. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, as I said before, we all think about, like, we talk about someday writing down these stories. I think the major roadblock is that most people aren't natural writers. They don't, and it takes time, and it's one of those things where I think the main reason, perhaps the main reason to do it on video is just the kind of ease of it, that you can do it in one afternoon. But I think you're totally right in that, you can read somebody's stories but not get a great idea of the kind of person they were, what their humor was like. A lot of the time, people's humor doesn't come across in the way that they write. They feel that they have to be more prosaic than they really need to be. It's difficult, I think, to write in your own voice. And so, I mean, interestingly, I found one of those little voice memo recorder, these tape recorders, in the back of a drawer about a year ago. And I played a few of the tapes, and I found my grandpa, my dad's dad, talking about his experiences during the Second World War. And this was just audio, but to hear his voice talking about these things, you got so much more of his personality and the way he was. And my dad, I remember my dad listening to it for, I guess, what must have been the first time in maybe 30 years, and saying to me, like, it's really nice to hear his voice again. And so I think, adding video to that is just yet another dimension to see how somebody not only speaks, but the way that they move, you see their mannerisms, the way that their eyes move around. It's I think you capture so much more of who somebody is.
The essence of somebody, the essence
Yes,
of their personality. Do you
absolutely.
think that social media, so I know a lot of us now live our lives online almost, and I think your persona online isn't necessarily the persona that you have day to day. It's would you still be the same person telling your story to not your social media following if you have one? Is that something that people consider, or do they think that they're leaving this legacy behind through their social media posts? And how many people would then look back? And actually, I'm going to be really honest, growing up in the 90s, I'm pretty glad social media wasn't around then, because some of the things that have been captured, I'm not entirely convinced that I would want to be my legacy.
I want to know more about your life now. You sound very interesting.
That's an entirely different set of stories for a different podcast, I think.
Well, I'll be
But
watching.
actually, when you look back, and I know you changed. So, for example, social media for me came out in my I'm being quite generous here, very late teens, very early 20s. And I was a very different person to the one I am now. The things I would have shared, perhaps, I would share a lot less these days. Do you think that people think that that's legacy? Do people even think about that as they age?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a question that will, I think, obviously only become more relevant as time goes on. People like us, who you might describe as sort of digital natives, you curate a version of yourself online, and it is written in ink, as they say, if it's online. So it's a really interesting question. I think it applies less to those, obviously, who are slightly older, but I definitely think that one of the things that I always say is that we're different people around different people. The way that I acted around my mum is different from the way that I act around my close friends. All those versions of you are still you, but they're just different kinds of you. You turn certain things up and turn certain things down, and I think that's the case with social media as well. But I do think I think this is a question we're all going to be asking ourselves over the next few decades: is how do I want to be remembered in terms of my digital footprint? Yeah, I find that it's something I probably should be thinking about as well.
I think you and I can perhaps revisit this in a decade's time and see where everybody's thinking is at around relating to this. And I'm sure that there'll be a whole raft of different opinions. How do you approach family members? Because this can be quite a sensitive area. Because what nobody wants to do, and again, we're very open on this podcast in the way that we talk about the inevitable happening, because I do believe we need to be more prepared for it, is how easy is it for someone to say, "Oh, I want to record your stories"? And do you ever find in your experience people say, "Why do you think I'm going to die? Is this what approach do you take?" Because I know that with my own family I could be fairly blunt and fun, but that's just who I am. How would somebody else approach that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one of the main reasons I've started this LifeReel community, a place for people to come online who are interested in doing this for the people they love, to kind of give their own perspective on things. In my mum's LifeReel, she talked a lot about how her dad didn't like talking about death or thinking about death, and I imagine if she had been in the position to approach him and ask him to do something like this, he probably would have been a bit hesitant to do it. People have lots of very interesting and different relationships with their loved ones, and so knowing how to approach them about this can be a really difficult thing to do sometimes. Kind of those relationship tectonics. One of the things I always say is, if you want your loved one, the most important thing is that they know just how much it would mean to you. And it sounds a little bit silly, but one of the things I always suggest people to do is just write a letter to them. Like, write down, take some time, either write it longhand or use a word processor or something, and just articulate exactly why you want to have all of these memories captured on video. And you can say, it's not because I think you're going to die anytime soon, but it's because I love you so much, and because I think you're a really interesting person, and because I believe in the concept of family legacy, and the people of the future, I think, deserve to know these stories. And whatever it is that you think might resonate with your loved one, I think if you write that down and print it out maybe and give it to them and ask them to read it, I think just them knowing what it means to you is probably enough to break through that barrier quite a lot of the time.
No, I agree there. I think that there would definitely be different ways, and it's what that hook is for people to agree to that. And I know not everybody's going to feel comfortable on camera, but I think people are getting more and more used to it. So perhaps it isn't the big deal that it would have been 30
Yes,
years ago.
I think there is, yeah, there's still definitely a lot of hesitation around it. Um, it's important for anybody listening to know, you know, if this is something you wanted to do with your loved one, or if this is something your loved one might want to do with you, you should know that within 5 minutes you stop being so nervous about being on camera. I've spent sort of 10 years almost as a videographer professionally, and a big part of my job is setting up lots of big scary cameras and lights, and sitting somebody down who's not used to being on camera at all, and just trying to get them comfortable. And the most important thing is just time. Just 5 or 10 minutes, they'll settle into it, and it'll be second nature. But I do understand that people can be a bit trepidatious going in.
I can imagine. So, what do you think is a good age? What, in your experience as well, what age are people coming to you? And I feel this very personally, and as listeners know, I did lose my dad very young, and it's perhaps not something. I'm the same age as he is when he passed. Now I'm 44 and a half. The half is very important. Um, I don't think I would have approached somebody in their 40s to record their story, but from personal experience, I know that actually the inevitable can happen at any time. Could we make a part two? I mean, I think is there a good opportunity? So life story part one, life story part two.
Yes, I mean that's certainly my intention with my dad. I interviewed my dad probably 2 3 years ago, and my intention certainly is to come back in 10 15 years time and do another interview with him. One of the things I'm kind of saying is 50 onwards is a good age to start talking with people, but of course at any age things can happen, and it's not always something that we can predict, you know. And so I'm not sure the case with your dad. Was that a sudden thing, or was that
It
kind of
was sudden, very
right?
unexpected. So there was no opportunity there for any kind of planning, which I think is part of the reason I'm so passionate around, without wanting to sound morbid, and that things do happen. It's making people aware so that they don't have the regrets. They have that opportunity
Yes,
to capture those things that otherwise would be lost.
yes, absolutely. I mean, I think honestly, I haven't said it yet, but I think this is a an absolutely amazing podcast idea. I think the concept of this is great because you're right. It's not so many of these things are things that we don't think about until it is too late. And I think what you're doing is absolutely amazing. And when it comes to, yeah, you know, the LifeReel thing, sitting down with somebody and interviewing them, I've said 50 onwards, but um, I think if my vision, I'm trying to extend my vision into the future, because I'm going to be spending a good portion, I think, of the rest of my life trying to make this a mainstream concept. I believe so strongly in it. I understand how profound a decision it's been for me, that if I can if I can sort of penetrate the culture with the idea that we should be interviewing the people we love on camera, then it may end up being that, you know, before people are 50, you know, their kids are saying, we should do this for you. This would be a really interesting thing to do. I don't quite know the answer to that, honestly, but I'm hoping that the more people can get FaceTime with this concept, you know, that the more likely it is that people will be interviewed before they pass away.
I think so. For me, I understand the concept of the community and asking questions. So if they were to come to you, we're going to put all your details in the show notes so people can reach out to you to find out more. What does it entail? If I called you up, Oscar, I'd really love to do one of these with one of my family members. What are the next steps? What is the process that we would have to follow to have one of these life reels made?
Sure. So the community, once you sign up, it's totally free to join. You will have access to, you know, a whole group of people who are doing exactly the same thing as you, which I think is incredibly important. I think one of the main reasons, all of the steps involved in making a life reel aren't actually that difficult, but it's more, I think there's a perception that it might take a bit of time and people can be discouraged by that. But I think if you have people around you who are doing the same thing, you'll be able to spur each other on. That's the main reason I've started the community. But within the community, we have a course called LifeReel Academy, the first section of which is totally free to look at. And that will show you, kind of give you a lot of advice about, you know, what questions to ask is one of the big ones. You know, people want to know what should I be asking my loved one when I talk to them? And so that's, you know, that's something I wanted to make sure that anybody who joined the community could get access to. And then, you know, what kind of format do you want your LifeReel to be? Do you want your loved one to be looking into the camera? Do you want them to be looking off camera? All of these kinds of decisions. And I think that first section, if you watched through that, you pretty much have everything that you need to go and sit down with the person you love and ask them a bunch of questions about their life. And then from there, I call that the LifeReel interview, and then the LifeReel proper is the documentary that you would make from that footage. So, you know, the rest of LifeReel Academy talks about scanning all of your family photographs and, you know, using free, very easy to use software that you can use to kind of digitally restore a lot of those photographs, because often we have photos that are, you know, torn and have creases in them and everything. And so being able to repair those is digitally is a really good idea. And then a bunch of tutorials on how to digitize your old family videotapes and everything. And then finally, taking all of those things and bringing it together into an edit to make this sort of 30-minute film about your loved one's life. That's what, in my mind, that's what the LifeReel is. And yeah, if you join the LifeReel community, I'll teach you how to do all of that.
Fantastic. Well, I hope everybody listening is going to race over to your website and have a look, because I'm so bought into this concept in terms of remembering stories. Everyone has their 15 minutes of fame, and there's nothing stopping absolutely anybody from doing this.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really, really useful. We will be linking all of the details in the show notes, so head on over. You're also on TikTok, as am I, so we can follow you on TikTok and YouTube as well.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I uploaded a YouTube video today, although this will be going out, I suppose, in a few months' time.
Fantastic. Follow you on there, and then I actually look forward to seeing some of these LifeReels as well in the future. We'll get back together, and in a decade we'll talk through again how people's attitudes have changed to this. Thank you so much for joining us today, Oscar.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you.